Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're talking about Lancome. It's not a name you hear very much amongst guys in the online fragrance community. There are a lot of women who love Lancome. There are a lot of classic Lancome fragrances that vintage collectors who collect both men's and women's fragrances tend to love come from this house. So there's a lot of history with Lancome in the general sense of fragrance, but specifically for men, no. This is a house that only ever really dipped its toe into the world of making men's market fragrances, and I feel like they only ever did it because they were acquired by a major conglomerate that pushed them in that direction, due to the fact that, well, there's money on the table, then let's go for it. However, before we get to that part of the story, I need to give you guys a quick breezer on Lancome and its origins for those of you who don't know anything about Lancome. Like I said, Lancome is not a name that your typical frag bro, I guess, I don't like using that term, made videos about that, but your typical online fragrance guy, Lancome is not a name that you will hear him say much or at all, because like I said, they only really ever dip their toes into the world of making fragrances for men, and usually when they put something out, it doesn't last on the market very long. It gets discontinued and becomes the kind of thing that only collectors really want or willing to pay big money for. That's just the name of the game with Lancome. Now, the brand started in 1935, and you might want to say it was a latecomer to the whole classic French perfume house thing. Like, the idea is Lancome, when they first unveiled in 1935 the World's Fair with 5 fragrances at their launch, they were more or less scoping down a barrel at Guerlain, Caron, Houbigant, houses like that. The classic, Marugia is another one. The classic French or European houses, so we could lump in British houses too, like Floris. But Coty is another one. They were really looking at competing in that space, not with the budding designer fragrance market. So Lancome was not going after Chanel. We're not going after Lanvin, and they never really would really try to compete in that particular space. They always just try to keep up with the Joneses if the Joneses were the classic French houses. Of course, as you know, things would kind of change. Let me look at my computer over here real quick, because there is some interesting things I've up on here so I can remember. Yeah, okay, so the thing is, Lancome picked a really bad time anyway to launch a fragrance house, because 1935 was kind of on the doorstep of World War II and smack in the middle of the Great Depression, So people in Europe still had some money. The Great Depression never affected Europe as badly as the US, because it was the result of a US stock market crash, but the whole world suffered, clearly. But anyone that had trade dealings with the US suffered, at least. So a lot of Europe did suffer to a degree, but like ripples in the water. By the time the financial fallout reached Europe, it was subdued somewhat from the deep impact of the shock waves of the New York Stock Exchange going down in 1930. So they had that against them, launching a house in the middle of the Great Depression, and like I said, a few years away from World War II, with Germany invading Poland and France. So And then the other thing they had going against them too was the fact that designers, like I said, were already starting to take big chunks out of the business that had typically been held under lock and key by Guerlain, Houbigant, again, those brands, those houses. And you had some, like I said, lower end ones like Dana. I already mentioned Cody. So these brands. Back when a perfume house was a perfume house, and they didn't necessarily have a direct relation to clothing or accessories or leather goods or whatever. So that would change with the success of Chanel. I know Parfums de Rosine is technically the first designer brand because it was started by a designer. However, it did not survive. So the first successful one is Chanel. Therefore, Chanel is the one that would kind of set the archetype, not just for designers, but ultimately all perfume brands operating in that economic tier going forward. So after number 5 became such a big success for Chanel, suddenly all the perfume houses, whether they were designer or not, needed comparable products. So that was the world Lancome was entering, is what I'm trying to say. And that did not necessarily bode well for them. They had their work cut out for them. The founders, which I have right here, Armand Pettigene and Guillaume Diornano. Yeah, Armand Pettigene and Guillaume Diornano. I had to write these down. That's why I'm just over here on my laptop. 1935. And yeah, the first 5 fragrances: Tendre Nuit, Bocages, Conquêtes, Kypra, and Tropiques. But then, you see, here's the thing that changed Lancome. This is why they are not spoken in the same tones as Guerlain or Houbigant or Caron. It's because the very next year, and anyone who's ever walked into a Macy's will know this, or any mid-tier department store, the very next year, Lancome launched skincare. 1936. Came out with the first, what was it? Yeah, they came out with the first, like, all-purpose, I mean, today we would call it a repair cream, but back then it was like an all-purpose skin-firming, moisturizing. It was just a cold cream, right? Like Pond's cold cream, but the Lancome version. And a lot of movie stars loved that. So many movie stars, especially women, loved the Lancome skin cream that it kind of overshadowed their perfumes. This was only after 1 year of being in existence. And then it just snowballs from there, because then a couple years after that, they would enter the market with lipstick, rose-scented lipstick, very popular rose-scented lipstick, to the point where like all lipsticks would eventually be rose or scented of something, you know. But the rose-scented Lancome red lipstick alongside the skin cream, suddenly their perfumes just were like second fiddle. And they continued to make them. Okay, they continued to make them, but they very quickly lost all scope of trying to compete with a Guerlain, a Caron, a Houbigant, you know, a Pinot, and then Marugia, Floris, etc., Coty. Suddenly they were in the same space as L'Oreal, you know, as Elizabeth Arden, as all of these other brands that make perfumes but also make cosmetics. So Estee Lauder is another one. Lancome would actually go head to head with Estee Lauder quite a bit, because Lancome was French. Estee Lauder was the plucky New York brand, right? So the plucky American brand. So you kind of had this whole, you know, Pepsi versus Coke sort of deal with the Estee Lauder and the Lancome. And I remember in most spaces in department stores where they sell the cosmetics and the perfume, the counters would not be next to each other. Like you would see like Estee Lauder, and then right next door you could have Elizabeth Arden, right, and Revlon or something. But no, the Lancome was always across and away from Estee Lauder, so they did not play well with each other. I can imagine like the Estee Lauder saleswoman like this, just grilling the Lancome lady. The Lancome lady's like back at her, and they're just all day long. Of course, those of you who were born in the 80s and grew up in the 90s like I did, or grew up in the 80s and were a teenager in the 90s like I was, 40s and up, you probably remember Mad TV and the Vancome lady, because they couldn't use the word Lancome. But the Vancome lady from Mad TV. And you have to realize there was some truth to that. The whole, ja, but you know what? You can't have that. That's the thing. The Lancome salespeople were very much taught to vet the customers, to be judgmental, to be uppity, because the whole idea was they were French. It was a French brand, very illustrious. So movie stars wear Lancome, okay? Lancome almost had like the whole Hermes thing where you had to kind of prove yourself to the Lancome counter why they should deal with you properly. I mean, if you just said, I want to buy this, they would get it off. They wouldn't refuse to sell to you, obviously. They weren't as bad as Hermes. They wouldn't shut the door in your face, but they would definitely give you the cold shoulder. They would still sell you something if you pointed out, I want that. They'd be like, okay, sure. And they would just be like, here, that'll be $100, and take your money, and that's it. They're done with you. But they wouldn't try to like upsell you anything. They wouldn't try to be welcoming or nice to you unless you were someone who fit the profile of their ideal customer. And if you respected their whole uppity, bourgeois thing about them, and let them tell you what's good for you and not question. So that's the thing. And the reputation of the Lancome salespeople of being very much like, just like this. And it's like the soup Nazi from the Seinfeld. Those of you who watch Seinfeld, where you're going to get treated badly. You're going to get treated like shit when you go in there. But that's kind of the point. It's the experience of going in there, and here's this person that doesn't care about your feelings and doesn't really give a shit who you are or what kind of money you have, because if you don't fit the profile, they don't really want you there anyway. But they're not allowed to refuse your service, so they will just be as surly as they can in hopes that you go away, or just give them money and then leave, right? Now, if you're someone that keeps up with all the Lancome stuff, and you wear the products correctly, and you know the lingo, and you're really into the whole pomp and circumstance, if you were that ideal customer, if you basically drank the Kool-Aid, right? If you joined the cult, then they loved you. Then you could spend all the money you wanted there and talk all day. The Vancome lady would be ha 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 like this and talk to you all day. So now, men's perfumes, because we're already halfway through the video. Men's perfumes. Lancome didn't really make any until after they were acquired by L'Oreal, which is funny because L'Oreal is another French cosmetics brand that also dabbles in perfume. And L'Oreal wanted to go big corporate. They didn't want to just be L'Oreal selling their own products. They wanted to sell other people's products. And now L'Oreal is this gigantic multi-limbed octopus that's taking over the world, just like LVMH, and we hate them for it. But back then they were not quite that big, but they had aspirations to be big. So they were doing something that a lot of cosmetic brands weren't doing yet. Coty wasn't doing it yet. Is they were going around getting licensing deals, right? They kind of looked at what Charles of the Ritz was doing, and they were like, we need to do that too. So they were snapping up properties like Jacques Fath to reintroduce green water, and among other things. they were snapping up all sorts of deals. They had a lot of designer deals really early on. They had Ted Lapidus early on, and they bought one of their longtime rivals, which was Lancome, paid for them with cash. Now, L'Oreal doesn't have the same sanctity that Lancome had about its customer base. And L'Oreal was like, no, you're going to make some men's fragrances because men's fragrances are really hot right now. I mean, look, Eau Sauvage, Brut. The 60s, men's fragrances really picked up. I mean, they were starting to pick up a bit in the 50s, the mid-century stuff, but it wasn't until the 60s. It was the 60s. There was a bit of a recession in the 50s. Those of you who weren't alive to know, I wasn't alive to know, but, I did my research. There was a bit of a recession in the 50s. But the 60s, the recession was over. Things were good again. People were spending money again. And the men's segment was growing. So this is where we get the first Lancome fragrance. And arguably both their most original one and their most iconic one. And that is Balafre. And I've done discussions on Balafre, so I won't say too much about it. But Balafre did something that no one else had done up until that point. And that was they basically combined a lavender fougere with a bay rum scent and then put like some leather under it. So you had the lavender, you had the sharp woody base, but then you had the round, sweet, clove, carnation, spiced rum notes. That sort of brown shoe kind of feeling. And no one was doing that. No one had taken Fougere Royale and Old Spice and went and put them together. No one had really done that. So Lancome did that. And Balafre became a huge success. And then nothing was really done with men's fragrances past that. That was their big bread and butter, big men's line. Until sales began to sag a little bit. And then when sales began to sag a little bit, in 74, they launched two new Balafre fragrances, Brun and Vert. And Vert is like the vetiver, woody side of the fragrance, separated from the rest. And Brun was like the typical spicy, clovey kind of leathery thing, again, separated from the rest. The big prominent lavender that was in the original Balafre from 67, the big prominent lavender would not be in either flanker, unfortunately. Not in either one. But the spiciness of the original would live on in the Brun flanker, and then Vert would also be the more vetiver-y, woody, sharp type of thing. Now, Lancome fragrances traditionally don't last on the market for very long. This is the reason why not a lot of guys really talk about them, because unless you chase unicorns, really expensive unicorns, you're not going to own a Lancome fragrance. And then, unfortunately, a lot of Lancome fragrances were either heavily copied or were copying something else. So they have a lot of analogs. And for example, if you don't want to spend the $1,000 it takes to get an original bottle of Balafre, yeah, it's that expensive. If you don't want to spend $1,000 on a bottle of Balafre, then you can just grab a bottle of this. It's still expensive. It's still discontinued, but you'll spend at least a quarter of the price. You might spend a couple $100 at most. Maybe you can get $100, I don't know what this goes for these days, but I'm sure it's not like $20 anymore. Not 20, $30 anymore, but this Eau Cendre is kind of like a poor man's Balafre. I actually prefer it to Balafre, honestly, but you can kind of see it as such. Or Olan from 1970 by Avon would also fit the bill. Very similar. Now, Lancome was kind of reaching the peak of its popularity in the 70s, in general, peak of its popularity. So they would actually launch a golf tournament in France, because there weren't really many golf tournaments in France. So they would launch something called the Trophy Lancome, 1970. And the Trophy Lancome would become so successful that eventually it was decided Armand Pettigene, before he eventually, gave up the company and passed away, he decided that there should be like every year a Trophy Lancome, and at some point they should make a fragrance for men, the next men's launch. Meanwhile, Balafre was kind of forgotten about. Like I said, the men's fragrances with Lancome don't last very long. They're on the market for a few years and then they go away. Now, I've got a bottle of Trophy Lancome. I've got a mini. I don't have a big bottle of it, but it's enough to say I own it for those of you who really care about that sort of thing, who are really big sticklers about ownership. You can't talk about a fragrance unless you own it. I'm like, okay, asshole. Well, here it is. Here's my mini. So shut the fuck up. I own it. There. Now, Trophy Lancome, I like it, but you have to realize it came out in 1982. And it came out in 82, and even though it's a very good fragrance, it was basically copying something that already existed. Now, I don't want to say it's a clone. It's not a clone, but where the hell is it? Wait a minute. Well, that's bizarre. I can't find my bottle of Eau de Guerlain. It's in here somewhere. I know it is. Oh, here it is. Okay. It's beginning to worry myself. I was like, where's my bottle of Eau de Guerlain at? It's right in front of me. That's why I didn't see it. But this, which came out in 74, is basically Trophy Lancome. The key difference is no rose in Trophy Lancome. They go with geranium and a couple other minor changes. But if you're looking for a floral, fresh, green chypre in the style of Eau Sauvage or something like Eau de Lancome, which was a unisex fragrance, Trophy Lancome is really just like Eau de Lancome revisited, more or less, and with a golf ball for a cap, really. So just buy the Eau de Guerlain and call it a day. Now, you can basically say that Trophy Lancome stayed in production only because it sold well due to the tournament. It was free advertising. They kind of marketed each other. The tournament, more or less, was marketing for the fragrance, and the fragrance was marketing for the tournament. So they kind of were codependent on each other. And Eau de Lancome was a very popular fragrance, and men were into the more green, fresh, herbal style, so it made sense to kind of lean on that structure. It was eventually discontinued when the tournament was discontinued, so Trophy Lancome, oddly enough, became the longest running men's fragrance that Lancome ever had, because it was made until the tournament was discontinued. No more tournament, no more need for the fragrance. So otherwise it probably would have been killed much sooner. Then you've got Sagamore. For some reason, Sagamore has developed a really huge cult following among men who are the typical obsessed with oak moss, obsessed with anything like 70s and 80s, obsessed with when real men wore real manly scents and all that. You know, I've gone to war with those people enough. You already know who you are. So, but the whole point is that whole subsection of people, mostly on base notes, not really anywhere else. Mostly they just double down on base notes. Our little miserable walled gardens. But they kind of put Sagamore on a pedestal. And I smelled Sagamore, and I was like, well, I mean, okay, Sagamore is great, but It's really just someone trying to take a 1950s style aromatic chypre for men and make it more 80s appropriate. So again, I can point you to other things that would serve basically just as well. If you like Sagamore, you can buy this. Now, if you're in America, you can't really buy this too easily. The original Paul Monsieur by Chanel is kind of hard to come by in the United States. It's not officially sold here, but you can get it. But if you're in Europe, yeah, you don't need to spend the finder's fee on Sagamore. Now, when they released Sagamore, I guess they learned pretty quickly that people didn't want that kind of an old-fashioned smell. It was too early for retro stuff in the 80s. People weren't ready for that yet. So a couple years later, in 87, they launched the Program Homme range, which was a full skincare scent and cosmetics range for men. It had shampoo, it had bar soap, it had skin toners and soothers, aftershaves. It was a full range. But they failed to really market it properly. So they were doing something cool and new by offering a full skincare, cosmetics, grooming range for men. Lancome, of all people, of all brands, would know how to do that well because their whole thing has been cosmetics. But they stuck it behind the Lancome counters, right? They didn't put it out anywhere for anyone to see. They didn't advertise it with commercials. And you didn't know about it. And like I said, those snobby Lancome ladies that don't want to deal with you unless you're the right kind of customer, you can imagine walking in there and being like a guy. And the last thing they wanted to see was a guy, right? Clearly. So you go walking in there like, yeah, I want that new Program Homme. And they're like, yeah, sure, I guess. But if you didn't know about it, you weren't going to know about it. And Program Homme was pretty good. I mean, it was in that same sort of aromatic, again, another chypre fragrance, but in that sort of heavier, mossier, leatherier, aromatic chypre. Again, there are analogs to it. Again, you can wear other things. But it sat somewhere in between things like Yadigan and Crizia Uomo and One Man Show and Dunhill Blend 30. So most of those are expensive and discontinued, but you can still get One Man Show for an okay price. So you can still get Marber Homme actually for a pretty good price too. So again, you have something you could wear in its place. But that fragrance could have gone places if it had been advertised more, but it wasn't. And fast forward to the 90s, and we would get Eau pour Homme, which Trophy Lancome was kind of already Eau de Lancome for men, really, it was. So then they decided to come out with Eau pour Homme, which was really sort of analogous to something like this. So again, if you've got Eau de Rochas Homme, you don't really need Eau pour Homme for the price you're going to pay to find a bottle in the wild. But it was a very green, citric, sharp, sort of, fresh without being aquatic, basically. Then 2001, they would come out with Miracle Homme. Now, this was interesting because they tapped Francis Kurkdjian for that one. They tapped Francis Kurkdjian for Miracle Homme. And in those years, he was more experimental than he is now. But he played around with having oak moss as a top note. The fragrance would eventually dry down to other things. It would have primarily a woody ambery base with some light white florals and lavender. But the fact that you got a blast of oak moss in the opening of the fragrance was very weird. Typically, you would expect that to be a base note. But that fragrance didn't really have an audience either because it came out in 2001. And in 2001, people were wearing big ozonic aquatic things or gourmand things, big heavy sweet things, or super fresh sharp things like Acqua di Gio. So a light woody ambery scent was just kind of not really going to appeal to anyone in 2001. It was almost, again, like a Gucci Rush, Christian Lacroix kind of thing. A Zaro Visit, you could wear a Zaro Visit too. Same sort of thing. None of those fragrances panned out, did they? Every single one of those got discontinued, just to give you an idea. And then last... What was that? Oh. My fan fell over. Don't pay me any mind. I was like, what happened there? Yeah, I'm not going to edit that out of the video. You guys have a jump scare. Congratulations. But last but not least, we're going to talk about Hypnos. Hypnos was the last men's fragrance released for Lancome. And I don't want to say it was the most popular because it was the most recent one. But it was the most... I guess, well-studied fragrance because it was doing a similar kind of thing as YSL La Nuit de l'Homme, where it was based around cardamom and lavender and had a semi-gourmand kind of woody oriental base. People liked wearing it to clubs because it was big and kind of sweet, rounded. So it was sold for a long time. It was not as long-term as Trophy Lancome, and did not make the same impact that Balafre did back in '67. But the last masculine that Lancome made was basically the one that stuck after 50 years of trying. 50 years of trying, they finally stuck one. And that one stayed in production until just before the pandemic. And then they haven't made anything since. And that was made back in 2007. So that thing sold for like 15-ish, years or so before they finally give up the ghost on that. So there you guys have it, man. Lancome. Mostly cosmetics, mostly perfumes, marketed towards women, not a whole lot of men's stuff. And at least now you know why you don't hear the name very often. This has been The Unlist. Catch you next time.